or covering of gray matter over the hemisphere. When we look at a section through the cortex, we see that it is just this outer part of the cortex. It's the light areas here on our picture. Within each of the lobes, we also talked about different structures that were located within the lobes or different areas. A lot of motor areas here in the frontal lobe, but also very complex functions here. Somatosensory back here, visual here, auditory here, and other complex functions in all of these lobes. Now, within each of these lobes, we saw that there was a horizontal organization that we referred to by Brodmann areas. So Brodmann divided the cortex up into those 50 different areas, and this just shows the lateral surface of the cortex, and you can see these are just the numbers that were originally given by Brodmann. This allows us to talk to each other, but there's another really important discovery that happened, and that is that one of the most important early discoveries was not made by Brodmann, but later, that each of these areas actually represents a functionally distinct area of the brain with a different function. Now, Brodmann just cut up the cortex and looked at the way the cells were organized. So all he made his numbering system based on were the differences in the way the cells were organized into layers. He didn't have any way of knowing that we would later in neuroscience discover that each of his areas would have a different function. Now, that gives a sort of horizontal organization to the cortex. But if we were to look in any specific area of the cortex and to make a little tiny, take out a strip of cortex through, say, the 6 layers in neocortex, we would discover that there's a vertical organization. So in a drawing we've made here shows you that this is just one gyrus here. This would be a sulcus. You take a strip of cortex about 1 to 2 square millimeters. You take it out and look at it. Say it is in neocortex, goes through all 6 of the layers. This little tiny strip is an independently functioning module. And how all these modules are connected to each other is understanding that is one of the goals of modern neuroscience. So while the cortex is the same thickness in all animals, in all species that have a cortex, the increase in the surface area in the human brain allows for an increased number of areas and an increased number of these little functional modules and their interconnections with each other. And this is what's allowed the increased information processing ability that we have as human beings. So this is just so critically important to understand. Now, when we looked in the first lecture at ancient peoples didn't even seem to have a conception that the brain was important at all. So I made the comment that, the brain was removed in pharaohs, for example. The pharaoh could enter the afterlife without a brain, but not without a heart. Now, of course, there's a joke among neurologists that one of the most important functions of the heart is simply to provide blood for the brain. And without the brain, the heart wouldn't function. The brain literally controls every organ in the body and controls everything you see, hear, or feel. It allows you to think. All of these things are a function of the cortex. So what we would like to do in the present lecture is to look at how the cortex has been parceled out in terms of sort of an overall function. So how the cortex has been viewed conceptually. And this is a little bit different of an orientation. So let's think about how early neuroanatomists looked at the cortex. In a historical sense, what they did was say that there's sensory areas and motor areas, and then there's association areas. Now, these early neuroanatomists had very limited knowledge of how the cortex was organized, so this is really how they parceled it up. You see back here is area 17, or primary visual cortex. Here's primary somatosensory cortex in our parietal lobe. Down here is primary auditory cortex. Many early neuroanatomists identified these primary areas. These would be sensory areas, which are the first cortical areas to get information from the individual nuclei in the thalamus. Now, they also recognized there was a primary motor cortex, but they also saw all this other cortex. And early neuroanatomists called this association cortex. And they believed that it was having all of this association cortex that was responsible for the fact that human beings were sort of at the top of the food chain. We could think, we could reason, we could do mathematics. And it was because of all this association cortex. In addition, many of these early neuroanatomists looked at the brains of other animals. So, for example, the lowly hedgehog. And lo and behold, the hedgehog had primary areas like primary somatosensory, primary visual, primary auditory. The hedgehog also has primary motor cortex. But once you've removed those areas, he doesn't have a lot left over. So the early neuroanatomists said, bingo, that's it. The human beings, we are what we are because we have all this other cortex. Well, the general classification into sensory, motor, and association cortex is still used in neuroscience, but it's been redefined, and this has resulted in a major paradigm shift in how we view the cortex conceptually. So, one of the most important discoveries that has been made, and this was made in the last 40 years, so it's very contemporary, is that much of what these early neuroanatomists thought was association cortex, so thought it was where we did all this higher order functions. A lot of this higher order cortex was actually sensory in nature. So it was actually higher order sensory cortex. Now I'll come back in a minute to why we think that that is true. But this is very, very important. So much of the cortex, in fact, is made up of more sensory areas. So now we have our primary sensory areas, just like we did before, and primary motor areas, shown here. But in the last 40 years, we've discovered that all of this, and all of this, and all of this are secondary sensory or motor areas. And so you see that they've chipped away at the association cortex. So it's been chipped away in a conceptual manner. So the subdivision of the cortex in modern neuroscience is, yes, we have primary sensory and motor areas, but we also have a huge amount of secondary and higher order sensory and motor cortex. We also have a little bit of association cortex, and we'll come back to that. Now let's think a little bit about why would we have so much of our cortex devoted, for example, to sensory information. And so the system which has been best looked at has been the visual system. And the visual system, primates are highly visual animals. And it turns out that human beings probably have, in addition to Area 17, 30 or more other areas of the cortex devoted to vision. Now let's think about what that's about. Here's this cortex we thought was like higher order association cortex, and now we find out it's sensory in nature. Well, how do we get information about the world? We get it through our sensory systems. And one of the things that characterizes human beings is the ability to make very fine distinctions based on sensory systems, so that ever more elaborate behavior can occur from taking in that sensory information and having this wide variety of behaviors open to us about how we behave in the world. So the more information we get through our sensory systems and the more elaborate our cortex is for looking at that sensory information, then the more complex our behavior can be. So in primates, we have a huge number of visual areas. We also have other areas devoted to other sensory systems. Now, we want to see how modern neuroscientists are going to subdivide the cortex. And the one area that, of course, everyone is interested in is the association cortex. So it turns out in human beings, we believe that there are 3 areas that still are called association cortex. So they're not really devoted, say, for example, to vision or to motor behavior. They are association cortex or higher order areas of the brain. Now, these definitions are constantly changing, so it makes it difficult to talk about it. But right now, this is the definition we have at the present time, that there are 3 major association areas recognized. And these are the prefrontal area, which is involved in executive functions, parietal, occipital, temporal areas, which are actually multimodal. So it turns out they're sensory, but the neurons in those areas respond to more than one sensory system. And last of all, the limbic cortex or limbic association cortex, which is involved in the elaboration of emotion and memory. So if we were to look again on a drawing, these areas show, here's our prefrontal association cortex involved in executive functions. Here we have multimodal cortex. Here we have limbic association cortex. These areas, this is really important to point out because these definitions are just constantly changing. The way we look at the cortex conceptually is really our way of dividing the cortex in a way that we can understand function. It's not necessarily nature's way of doing it. So, for example, when we look at multimodal cortex, well, that is sensory. So maybe that shouldn't be an association area. It's still a sensory area, even though it's multimodal. There's also been a blurring of distinction now between this prefrontal area on this lateral part of the hemisphere involved in executive function and this area here, which is part of the limbic association area involved in emotion and memory. The blurring comes because we now know that without an elaboration of emotion, we aren't able to make rational decisions. So we're not able to execute executive functions. And so there's been this blurring now of the distinction between these 2 areas. So I think as time goes on and we understand more and more about what these areas do, then I think that we will redefine the cortex again in this conceptual way. And I think that that will be very, very important. Now, there's another reason that research in this area hasn't moved as quickly as it possibly could have, and that's because really only human beings have a really well-developed, for example, prefrontal cortex. So while other primates do have prefrontal cortex, it isn't elaborated in the way it is in us. When you look at Brodmann's map, you see that this prefrontal area is made up of a large number of areas. And there's no way to do research in human beings where you would remove one of those areas and see what happens. What we do have in neuroscience and what we do have that can give us some idea as to what's going on in these areas of the brain, we have one unfortunate thing, and that would be natural lesions that occur in patients who, say, have a brain tumor in a particular area of the brain. So if a patient has a brain tumor in a particular area and that patient loses a particular function, then that tells us something about what that area might be involved in. Now, the function isn't located in that area. All of these areas and modules are complexly interconnected to each other. But we could make the assumption that something important about that function was being controlled by that area. So those are natural lesions. Well, the problem with natural lesions is that nature doesn't care what we're interested in. And what happens when people have brain tumors or any other kind of damage to the brain, it usually isn't just in one of Brodmann's areas. So it covers a larger area, which means, again, it makes it difficult to figure out what each individual area of a complex structure might be doing. Now, in modern neuroscience, we're very fortunate. We have developed newer techniques that are allowing something never before that we've been able to do. And that is that we have actual MRIs. We can now use magnetic resonance imaging, and combining it with other techniques, we can actually have people in a magnetic resonance imaging machine. We can ask them to do various tasks or to think various things, imagine various things, and we can look at what areas of the brain actually have functional active neurons. And so when someone is thinking a word, we can look and see what areas of the brain light up when the person thinks those words. So these are non-invasive methods which are giving us a great deal of information in neuroscience and are going to yield a lot of valuable information about this prefrontal area, these association cortices. Now, other paradigms, not just this one about how we divvy up the cortex, but other paradigms have also been challenged by modern neuroscience. So let's talk about a few of those. So historically, and actually until very recently, it was believed that only a few functions, for example language, appeared to be related to only one hemisphere. So when a function is only controlled by one hemisphere or the other, we say that that function shows hemisphere dominance. So, for example, for language, the left hemisphere of the brain is normally dominant for language, and it doesn't make any difference whether you're right-handed or left-handed. So whether you're right-handed or left-handed, about 95% of people show a left hemisphere dominance for language. So how has this paradigm been challenged in modern neuroscience? Well, one of the ways is that we now know that while it's true the left hemisphere, in order to understand language and to speak language, we need an intact left hemisphere, we actually now know that the right hemisphere does a whole lot of things related to language. And it's been the discovery of that has helped us see what certain areas in the non-dominant hemisphere are actually doing, and it will be a topic of one of our later lectures. Now, it's also known that for other functions, the historical position was that this hemisphere, so as I'm standing here, this would be my left hemisphere. The historical position for other functions that didn't show dominance was that this hemisphere would process information from that half of the world or that half of the body and control the movement on this other side of the body, which we refer to as the contralateral side of the body. So this was a basic principle that in general is true. One hemisphere controls the movement and processes information from the contralateral half of the world or body and controls the movement on the contralateral side. So if you have brain damage to your motor cortex on the left, it's the right side of the body that you have trouble moving. And in general, this sort of crossed ability or the crossed processing of information. So for the visual system, if I drew a line straight down here and I look straight ahead, this half of the visual world is processed by my visual cortex on this side, and this half of the visual world is processed by my visual cortex on the contralateral side. And this general principle is true, so that paradigm is in general true, but we're learning some things that we didn't know before. So, one of the things we have learned is why we have this crossed sort of system, or at least why the cross system occurs. And so I thought I would use the motor system because it's the most obvious, and also because you've seen these before. And so it will just bring back some information that we've covered previously in the class. Let's imagine that this is a motor neuron that is located in area 4 in the frontal lobe. This is primary motor cortex. It's involved in the initiation of a motor movement. So our general paradigm, which is in general true, it will mean that motor neurons that are on the left side of the brain in area 4 are going to initiate movement on the right side of the body. Why does that occur? Well, if we look at this again, we see here that the axon that leaves this neuron in motor cortex, this neuron is in motor cortex in either layers 5 or 6. This axon will leave these neurons and will come down through the brain, down through the brain stem, and in the lower medulla will cross to the other side of the body and will enter the spinal cord at a particular level to make connection with neurons in the spinal cord. And it's the neurons in the spinal cord that go out to the muscle on that same side. So this is why motor neurons on this side of the brain control the movement on that side of the body. And so for many of the pathways, we've been able to trace out how the neurons are connected, so we at least know why it is true, or why the general paradigm holds true, that one half of the visual world, one half of the world in general, or one half of the body, either in its ability to feel or to move, is processed by the other side of the cortex. Now, while the statement is true, and while this paradigm is in general true, modern neuroscience has revealed some very, very interesting things. So, for example, we have learned that there are many functions that are handled very differently than this. And that is that it isn't just crossed, that there's some very higher order functions that seem to be the province of one of the hemispheres in a very interesting way. So, for example, individuals who have strokes that involve their left hemisphere have a tendency to be depressed. Now, the assumption was made that individuals were depressed because if you have a stroke of your left hemisphere, you may lose the ability to move on the right, you may be paralyzed, you may have difficulty speaking and understanding language. These are pretty important human functions. So the assumption was made that individuals who had strokes in the left hemisphere were depressed because they lost these very, very human abilities. Well, it turns out that that's probably not so. They may be depressed for that reason, but in general, any kind of damage to the left hemisphere causes a depression of mood. Whereas if you have damage to the right hemisphere, you're much more likely to be manic in your behavior, even if it's inappropriate. So patients who have lost incredible function from right hemisphere strokes, for example, may seem very up in their mood, even though they're paralyzed on the other side of their body. And that's because mood is being processed in very different ways by the two hemispheres. Now, a last example here of how a paradigm is being shattered in neuroscience is related to that old structure called the little seahorse, the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is an old cortical area located in the temporal lobe involved in learning and memory. And the hippocampus was always believed, it's an old cortical area, so it was basically believed to be doing the same thing on both sides of the brain. So you have two hemispheres, you have a hippocampus on one side, you have a hippocampus on the other side. Well, modern neuroscience has shown us that, in fact, the hippocampus on the left side of the brain is more involved in being able to remember words and being able to remember episodes in your life, therefore contributing substantially to an ongoing story your brain creates, which we call an autobiography. And your right hippocampus is involved in spatial memory. Now, this is very important to me because I get lost no matter where I go, so I'm pretty sure I don't have a right hippocampus. So this spatial memory on the right, and many of the functions overlap between the structures, but actually there's like a dominance for structures on the sides of the brain that we never before thought there was a dominance. So let's stand back from this information. We really look at it, it looks like the two hemispheres, what's happened is some functions are being taken over like and elaborated by one hemisphere versus another. And it's like we really have two brains in our head. We have two independent brains in our head. And this may be a strategy that evolution has used to increase the number of functions that our cortex can do without adding a lot of areas. So you have the hippocampus on one side specialized in a certain way rather than the other side. In other animals, the two hippocampi on both sides basically do the same thing. So this may be a strategy so that our head doesn't have to get much bigger, which would be difficult for women to give birth to a baby because the brain has to be developed to a certain point. So this may be a way of increasing functional areas by keeping the cortex approximately the same size. So if we have two brains in our head, how is the information in the two hemispheres coordinated? Well, it's coordinated via that corpus callosum, those 300 million axons that connect one cortical area in one hemisphere with the same area in the other hemisphere. We saw earlier, if you were to look down on the brain and you were to take your fingers, I literally do this for students, push the brain aside like this and look down on top of the brain, you see 300 million axons connecting the two hemispheres, the cortex of the two hemispheres. And so it's like we have two brains in our head, but everything is coordinated because of the corpus callosum. Now, I want to give you an interesting clinical example so that you understand what we mean by having two brains in our head. In individuals who have uncontrolled epilepsy, often an epileptic seizure will spread across the corpus callosum to the other side of the brain. And if drugs are not able to control these seizures, each time a seizure occurs, neurons die. And so it's very important to control seizures. So if medication can't control the seizures and can't control the spread of the seizures, sometimes neurosurgeons will go into a person's brain and they will sever the corpus callosum. And that prevents the epileptic seizure from spreading to the other hemisphere. Now, what was amazing about this is when they first did this, neurosurgeons were amazed that the individuals where they sectioned the corpus callosum, they seemed to be perfectly normal. They didn't seem to have any functions that were lost. If you think about this, though, normally when we do something like cook or we talk to someone or whatever, we have both of our eyes open, both of our ears are working, and notice when the corpus callosum is sectioned, all the projection pathways are still intact. Remember, the projection pathways are the pathways that are going up and down in the brain and connecting neurons between each other, but they're independent of the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is just connecting homotopic parts in one hemisphere, cortex, with a homotopic part in the other hemisphere. So the projection pathways are still intact. People can see whatever. So neurologists did some very careful testing of these individuals, and here's what they found. I want you to imagine that I'm such a patient, and I'm being asked to look straight down, to focus forward like this, to foveate on something in front of me, and an object is presented in one part of my visual field. So there may even be a partition here, so I can only see with one eye or the other. If something is held up here in this half of the visual field, which is processed by this part of my brain, and I'm asked what this is, if this is presented in my left visual field, I can see it, but I can't say what it is because there's no communication via my corpus callosum to language areas in the left hemisphere that talk. Now, if this is presented in this part of the visual field, which is processed by my left hemisphere, this is my right visual field, then I can not only see it, but I can also say that it's a pen. And so what we discovered is that, in fact, individuals who have had their corpus callosum sectioned do, in fact, have two independently functioning brains in their head, but because they have both eyes open, and they experience the world still as a unitary experience, and you have to test very carefully to be able to see any lost function. Thank you.